So if I were to ask you to name one psychologist that you know of, what psychologist would you name? And I do this in psychology classes on a regular basis. My guess is that you would name the psychologist that I'm going to talk about in this video. In this video, I'm going to do a quick review of a short introductory book about Sigmund Freud. The book is Anthony Storr's Freud, a very short introduction. And so I have some positives and some negatives, as well as a recommendation that I'd like to make to you about the book. Hi, my name is Chris Gibson, and I'm a psychology and religion professor. And this channel is all about reviewing academic and popular psychology and religion books. Generally, I like to review books, academic or popular, that are written by experts. What would a psychology book review channel be without at least one book about Freud? And really, I need to do a book by Freud as well. I just haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. But let me know in the comments if you'd like for me to review more books on Sigmund Freud or by Sigmund Freud. Just mention that below in the comments if you would. Since I teach psychology, one psychologist that you just have to know about is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis and I would consider him this personally, the father of clinical psychology. Now I know some clinical psychologists will have an issue with me saying that probably, but when you look at what he did, what he actually did, okay, and not just the caricatures of him, you could see why he might be considered the father of clinical psychology. But either way, Freud is still very influential, unconsciously and consciously, on psychology today. So here's where I'm going in this video. I'm going to give you a short review of the book, which will be followed by a longer review. No worries, if you just want the short review, no problem. When the short review is done, do me a favor, click like, give me a comment if you like the short review, or if you want to interact with it, and just move on. I get it. But so there's that, but then I am going to follow that with a longer review. Go chapter by chapter through the book. And just let me know, do you like the short review idea? Do you like the longer review idea? Storr begins with Freud's biography to show his psychological development. Freud was born on May 6, 1856 in Freiburg, now Pribor, in the Czech Republic. Freud was ethnically Jewish and intellectually atheist. From 3 years old until 82 years old, he lived and worked in Vienna. World War II forced him, ultimately, the rise of the Nazis, World War II, forced him to take refuge in London, where he died at 83 years old. So he only lived there about a year before he passed away. This is the key to Storr's book, though, about Freud. And it comes from Freud's mentor, Josef Breuer. He says here that Freud is a man given to absolute and exclusive formulations. There is a psychical need, which, in my opinion, this is Breuer speaking, leads to excessive generalization. So Storr agrees with Breuer's 2 points concerning Freud here. The first is that Freud did not tolerate those around him disputing his claims. And if you look at his history and his development, as he's developing psychoanalysis and gaining followers, he did not tolerate anyone to disagree with him. Okay, if they did, he kicked them out of the Psychoanalytic Society and he maligned their reputation horribly. He did this with Adler, he did it with Jung, he did it with others. The second thing is, while admitting that Freud was an original thinker, Storr acknowledges that Freud overgeneralized from a small sample of cases. And this is a major criticism you come across of Freud constantly, that he has really a small number of cases, that he creates these general theories, these universal theories, this meta-psychology from. These two observations explain Freud's rocky relationship with several of his early followers, as well as his controversial and original thinking. Now, Storr returns to these themes repeatedly in his book. Okay, Breuer's comments come up over and over in Storr's book. In reference to dream theory, Storr shows Freud's focus and overgeneralization in pages 45 and 46. Concerning the Schreiber case, Freud again, he shows original clinical observations, but he doesn't dig deep enough into the case history to truly understand it. So much of his explanations match his theory more than they match the facts of the case. And that's a problem with Freud. As someone said, Freud was more concerned about his theory than he was about his clients, quite often. So one might say, though, that Storr's hermeneutic for interpreting Freud is Breuer's perspective on Freud and his work. And it truly is, as you read Storr's book. He recognized Freud's genius while admitting to Freud's shallowness in details. He compliments Freud's creative thinking and even clinical descriptions while acknowledging Freud's overemphasis on sex, which is a constant criticism of him as well. Storr sees this as well throughout Freud's work. Storr exhibits a great chronological knowledge of Freud's work, which I really like this fact. He understands the development of the psychoanalytic theory in Freud's work. And so he interacts with both primary and secondary sources up to 1989 when the book was written. And he supports his points from Freud's writings. And his evaluation of Freud and the secondary sources, I would say, are fair and they're balanced. Storr interacts with the secondary literature up until the point, where the book is written and published. And I think it's very helpful. And he's selective. He picks the best of the secondary literature to actually interact with. And so it's helpful when you're reading Storr to recognize that he is fair, he is balanced in this book on Freud. Overall, Storr's book is substantial for its size because it's a small book. And it serves its purpose as an introduction to Freud. There are points at which Storr is confusing, though, and I would say that, and his chapters don't flow. It's interesting to me that some of his chapters have headings throughout the chapter. And those headings help you to understand where he's heading, what he's discussing, and the flow of the chapter. But then in other chapters, there are no headings. And I'm trying to figure out the flow of the chapter, and I just can't see the flow of the chapter even after I was kind of outlining it. And so I don't know, I think that might be more due to Oxford Press not doing more with it, maybe editing it. And maybe they just didn't do a thorough enough job in that, I guess. Here, I think Storr, though, frankly, I think he does a good job. It's a good value for its money. It's a good value for its content, for its interaction with both Freud's original works, primary and secondary sources. One other noticeable thing, though, is this. Storr has written books about Jung as well. Several times he attempts to reconcile Freud and Jung. Now, obviously, it didn't happen in their lifetime because, they cut each other off. But it's like Storr is attempting to reconcile Freud and Jung in his book. And I find that kind of just interesting in his doing that. Last thing, Storr does have a great annotated bibliography in the end of this book. Of course, that's limited because it's only up until 1989. And so if you want more recent works on Freud, you'd have to look at a different source. But I did think it was a very good annotated bibliography here at the end of the book. So really my question of the day would be this. This is the end of the short review. The longer review is going to continue after this. Let me know in the comments if you prefer the short review or the longer review if you do go ahead and watch the rest of it. I appreciate your feedback, especially as I try to identify what is helpful and what is not, because I want these reviews to be helpful to you and in your reading of psychology, and if they're not, then I want to improve them to make them where they are. Another thing is, if you do decide to purchase this book, please consider using my Amazon affiliate link that's down in the description below, and thank you for that. Now, I do want to continue with the longer review, though. because it's really worth going through the chapters of this book, I think. And so there are 12 chapters in this short little book. And Storr is selective, though. He's selective, and he addresses primary aspects of Freud's work, some of the controversies surrounding it, and current perspective at the time of writing this book. So Storr also, he mentions notable people, because there's a lot of notable people throughout Freud's work, his biography. If you wanted to know more about some of these people, at least you would have some idea of their relationship to Freud. So chapter 1 does deal with Freud's biography. Storr gives enough biography to explain Freud's psychology. It provides context for it. From the mid-1890s to the end of his life, Freud's biography is the history of psychoanalysis. And I know that I've read some other books that say, no, you can separate Freud and psychoanalysis. Well, early on, you really can't. Freud is psychoanalysis. And so I kind of tend to disagree with Stephen Mitchell on that in his book. Storr psychoanalyzes Freud, though, in explaining the development of psychoanalysis, which I kind of found was interesting. He ends this chapter with recognizing Freud's desire for psychoanalysis to be a science. Now, there are problems with that. Psychoanalysis will never truly be considered a science because of its methodology. And Storr recognizes that. But he also acknowledges Freud's desire for it to be a science. Chapter 2 shows the early development of psychoanalysis. This chapter discusses hypnosis and hysteria. Charcot demonstrated this to Freud as Freud went to Paris to study with Charcot for a time. Freud found that ideas matter, and that was an important discovery for him. Intangible ideas produce effects in terms of psychopathology. So Josef Breuer and Freud wrote a book together called Studies on Hysteria, and they deal with this. He identified a conflict in the mind between the idea and emotion that give rise to neurosis. So these two are at odds, and because of the conflict between the idea and the emotion, what happens is a neurosis. Past emotions cause present problems. So an emphasis you see on psychoanalysis is on the past, the person's individual personal past. This is the point where Freud turns to sexual explanations, and Storr presents Freud's theories, most notably the seduction theory, as well as responses to them. Chapter 3 deals with Freud's emphasis on the past. Storr discusses Freud's psychosexual developmental theory. According to Freud, a person becomes fixated at a particular stage and exhibits various neuroses because of the conflict that it causes. Current science does not support his theory, although Storr comments, if we express Freud's idea in psychological rather than anatomical terms, very few people would take issues with it. Freud did try to root his theory in biology and physiology, but at the same time, he kind of gave up on that to a degree as well with his project of scientific psychology. Chapter 4 discusses his methodology. Freud abandoned hypnosis for free association from about 1892 forward. Funny thing was, Freud found out he was no good at hypnosis anyway, even though he tried and he even studied with some other people. And so he finally just got rid of using hypnosis. Also, Freud uses dream interpretation to search below the surface of consciousness for the root of the neurosis. He published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1899. His theory of dreams emphasized wish fulfillment. Storr discusses the theory in greater detail, including various types of content and types of dreams. Lastly, Freud discovered transference as well, which this is important, and continued to develop his understanding of it in the future. Storr points out that recent psychoanalysis recognizes not a sexually oriented transference, but a relationally oriented transference. Storr goes on to point out that Freud's desire for psychoanalysis as a science and challenges its scientific validity. So a couple things there. One is, Freud considered his dream book the major book of his career, and the book that was really foundational to all of his works, where if I were going to review one, I would probably go to his Interpretation of Dreams book and read it to review. Another thing with transference. Transference has been shown to be an important tool in psychotherapy, as the clinician sees what the client is projecting onto them and see the way they act and respond. It provides a wealth of information of what's going on and how the therapist can help the client. Storr, of course, does challenge the scientific validity of psychoanalysis and says it would be better as a hermeneutic than a science, which he's not the only one with that perspective. Several have made that argument. Chapter 5 gives us Freud's theoretical advances during World War I and the early 1920s. Freud advanced his theory of narcissism, which leads into a reconceptualization of his personality theory. His personality theory initially includes the conscious and unconscious. The unconscious arose from a repression of things unacceptable to the conscious. Freud's clinical experience challenged this idea, though. Freud developed a new mental model consisting of the id, ego, and superego. And this is probably, if you've studied Freud or come across his work, this is pretty well known. You usually have the iceberg illustration about what's above the surface, in terms of consciousness, and what's below the surface, unconscious. The id focuses on the pleasure principle of fulfilling its sensual needs. The ego focuses on the reality principle, meeting the needs of the id in a way that meets with reality. The superego follows the moral principle. In other words, the expectations of society and the morality of society. So the ego then has to mediate between the id and the superego to see that the needs are met, but they're met in a socially acceptable way. Two instincts develop in his revised theory, the sexual and the aggressive. The aggressive becomes the death drive. These two drives are perpetually in conflict with one another. Chapter 6 deals with aggression, depression, and paranoia. For some unknown reason, this chapter contains no section headings, and the material all kind of just runs together. Storr here, though, he continues his discussion of the death instinct and says, during our lifetime, our death instinct is generally expressed in aggression toward others, except when it is inhibited, which results in it being directed toward oneself. This then leads to the discussion of depression and paranoia. At the end of the chapter, Storr discusses the Schreiber case, which I've already mentioned above as well. Chapter 7, though, is really the turning point in this book. If I were going to create sections of this book, this would start the next section of it. It transitions from Freud's clinical theory to his extension of it into this comprehensive theory of everythingism. Storr begins this discussion with Freud's application of psychoanalysis to everyday life and humor. Freud wrote The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which was one of his most popular books, and it included ideas such as the Freudian slip. We say one thing when in fact we mean our mother. Or we say one thing when in fact we're referring to sex, or something like that, right? Storr again once points out Freud's original ideas as well as his overgeneralizations. Freud also wrote a book called Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious in 1905. Another interesting book. It's really a book of Jewish humor. The problem is when you translate that from German to English and also from a Jewish culture to a non-Jewish culture, it doesn't translate well. A lot of times humor does not translate very well. Chapter 8 shows Freud's engagement with art and literature. Freud's work encouraged artists and writers to turn inward. He wrote several books and articles on art and artists. He wrote Delusions and Dreams in Jensen's Gradiva. He wrote Leonardo da Vinci in A Memory of His Childhood. He wrote The Moses of Michelangelo. And he wrote Dostoevsky and Parricide. He connected the creation of art to unsatisfied sexual desire. Storr continues this chapter with a discussion of each work. Much of Freud's views in relation to art and literature have now been rejected, though. He certainly takes his psychoanalytic theory and applies it to these areas, and is at least interesting. Although, once again, Freud tends to ignore the details that do not fit with this theory, which is one of the problems with Freud's overall work. Freud moves on in chapter 9. Storr discusses his perspective on culture and religion. Freud extended psychoanalysis to every area of life. It serves as a philosophical hermeneutic applied to all areas of existence, including culture and religion. This chapter covers 3 of Freud's books that deal with both culture and religion: Totem and Taboo, Moses and Monotheism, and the Future of an Illusion. Here's the problem. First, Freud bases his arguments on armchair anthropology and selective science that is not accepted today. Some of which, it wasn't even accepted at the time in which he wrote the books. He chose what best fit his theory and his argument. A second problem with this is that he calls this unnecessary war between psychology and religion. He regarded religion as a universal obsessional neurosis, which this idea still persists in some circles today. Once again, Freud's excessive generalizations appear. And I've seen stats on this and I know some science would disagree that psychology is even a science, but among those who do, many of them still are anti-religious. And it seems that the anti-religious stance has been around since Freud and has been built into certain schools of psychology, which is unfortunate. Now, of course, Jung didn't go that way. Jung held to this vague mysticism, but he wasn't anti-religious in doing so. And so we have that war beginning here with Freud and continuing in many realms of psychology. Chapter 10 looks at Freud as a therapist, free association, dream interpretation, transference. These are all essential to psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic practice. Freud established other therapeutic practices such as selection of patients, which I thought this was really interesting. This is something that, frankly, intelligent clinicians that do have a choice, they do this today. They know there's some patients they can work well with and some they can't. Freud did this. He selected his patients carefully. Also, he did a trial basis for therapy. A lot of times clinicians today will meet with a client one time, maybe 2, to determine if they should work together or not. Another thing that Freud did was he considered the age of the patient. He had certain ideas that if a patient is over a certain age, they're not going to change. And so he didn't work with patients over a certain age. He suggested that therapists do not take notes, for instance. And I know therapists are kind of split on this. That he also said therapists needed to maintain objectivity and not self-disclose to the client. Now, objectivity is part of what therapists bring to the relationship for therapy, and that makes sense. Also, self-disclosure. Even, whether it's a master's level counseling program or a doctoral program, you're taught about self-disclosure. If it's not for the purpose of helping the client and not kept short, don't do it. And so Freud had already built or was teaching some of these principles that we practice today still. Now, it was interesting. There's some things we depart with from Freud. He met with clients daily, except for Sundays, he required payment. And with the required payment, he felt like if they didn't pay, they didn't invest in the therapy. And so he required payment. He also discouraged multiple relationships, that you shouldn't have a relationship outside of therapy with the client. And he didn't practice it perfectly. He did his daughter's psychoanalysis for Anna Freud. He did it, and that's, I mean, what more, that's certainly a dual relationship, okay, or multiple relationships. She's your daughter, family member, as well as you're doing therapy with her. Freud, though, gave us principles that we even follow today, even though he didn't follow them perfectly. Storr then discusses Freud's case studies, and he concludes by saying this: "My own view is that Freud was far more interested in ideas than he was patients," which I referred to this quote earlier. Chapter 11 brings us up to date with psychoanalysis. Storr brings up two issues with the effectiveness of psychoanalysis. One is the differences in practice and definition of cure, which, if you don't define it in similar ways when you do the research, then it's hard to determine whether or not it's truly the same practice and the same in terms of the definition of cure. He goes on to point out the importance of relationships, analyzing transference, and the repetition of past patterns. It is difficult to define psychoanalysis, but Storr gives 5 characteristics of it in his book. Lastly, I'm going to go into chapter 12 briefly. It shows the appeal of psychoanalysis. Freud created a synthesis of ideas that provided a comprehensive explanation of life. Storr points out that it takes on the tone of a religion with dogma and disputes, with disciples and dissidents. In spite of his lack of scientific integrity, it seems to draw us intuitively into it. So this ends the long version of this review, and once again, let me know what you think. Which is helpful? Is the long review helpful, or do you just prefer brief review, the short review? And so, let me know what you think. Also, thanks for watching. If you are interested in purchasing this book, and you typically purchase through Amazon, please consider using my affiliate link down below. And thank you for checking out this book review.